Many of us in this audience know and love our next speaker. I think many of us read his articles first. In that connection, he has some tactical habits in his writing which I refer to as Stangisms, and about which I have been writing him now these many years, at least 6 years that I can recall, when I've been bringing some of these Stangisms to his attention. And in that connection, and with respect to Mr. Alan Stang, in terms of my introduction today, I have put it into Stangese, so that we will all feel quite at home before our next speaker reaches the podium here. What is, in fact, happening to local law enforcement today? This is a question more and more Americans are asking. Indeed, it is a question which demands an answer because, needless to say, the danger represented must be averted. We know, of course, that the first step towards solving a crisis is to gain an understanding of what has brought about that crisis. It is important to note that accurate information must precede responsible action. Indeed, we have Alan Stang with us today to tell us what is happening, how it started, and what concerned Americans can do about our local police crisis. In fact, Alan Stang is one of the most outstanding researchers and writers in America today. Indeed, his authoritative book on the civil rights movement, It's Very Simple, has won wide acclaim, and over 500,000 copies have been circulated. It is interesting to note that his study of the life and actions of John Foster Dulles, entitled The Actor, will, of course, remain an important analysis of United States foreign policy for decades to come. In fact, several million reprints of his columns, articles, and speeches have been distributed, and, needless to say, many thousands have heard him speak. In other words, Alan Stang is not just an armchair student of the contemporary scene. In fact, he was on the spot in Chicago in 1968 as revolutionaries fomented riots at the Democratic Convention. Indeed, he traveled throughout the Southwest, getting the true story about an abortive revolt by the Marxist Tijerina to create a separate Soviet satellite in New Mexico, and, of course, had his life threatened as a result. Today, Alan Stang will be talking sense to us about our local police. Indeed, I hope each of you will pay careful attention to his analysis of the problem and to his recommended solution. It is indeed a pleasure to welcome today a man who has indeed earned the respect and, of course, the admiration of countless Americans, Mr. Alan Stang.
Ladies and gentlemen, may I begin, with your permission, by telling you first that I found that introduction sadly deficient. Mr. Hoopengarner neglected to say observe. As you know, this is a key element in my writing style, and I feel that if a man is going to get up here and claim to introduce me in my style of writing, he should throw in at least a couple of observes. Of course, Jan doesn't do too bad for a short-haired freak. Well, ladies and gentlemen, let me begin by clearing up something that I'm sure some of you at least have been wondering about. You've been looking through your program there and looking at the pictures and the names of the speakers. And on page 4 or 5, I think it is, you notice there's a picture there of a fellow named Welch. And some of you may be wondering who this fellow is and what he's doing here. So let me begin by answering the question. As you know, We are a moderate organization, and we want to avoid even the appearance that we are discriminating against any group. And so pursuant to that basic policy of the society, we needed to find a token white Protestant to balance out the program. And this fellow Welch was the only one we could come up with. You know, I was reminded when Jan gave that introduction, when I went to New Mexico one time, they sent me word, Tijerina said if I went back to New Mexico, the next time I went back, I would be killed, is the word we got in Belmont. So Larry Pearson, he was running our speakers bureau at the time. The minute he heard that, he sent me right back in. Total guts. Never turns down a challenge. Now also, Mr. Armour told you that these things that we do don't just happen, and he may have created a kind of a misleading impression. They do just happen. Everything we do is spontaneous. I don't want to give you the impression there's any planning behind any of this. When I go to Idaho to research Frank Church, when I fly in with King Kennedy, when Mike Thomas, the Mormon Avenger, meets us at the airport, this is not planned. This is all spontaneous. I thought I should clear that up. Now, it says in the program I'm supposed to talk to you today about the police. So let me remind you of a few things that most of you, I'm sure, are all aware of. If you've been reading our material, we've repeated these things countless times in article after article, book after book. I have, Gary Allen has, we all have. Let me just remind you of a lot of things that you are already aware of. First of all, of course, every dictator has to have a national police force with unlimited powers. This is true of every dictator that we've ever heard of. Every dictator has to have a national police force with unlimited powers because every dictator knows that people, no matter what kind of people they are, do not want to live under a dictatorship. And so a dictator knows that if he doesn't have a national police force, the people he is enslaving will meet, organize, rise up, and kick the dictator out. And so every dictator organizes a national police force as soon as he takes over in order to suppress the people he is enslaving. As a matter of fact, usually the dictators organize these national police forces even before they take over. And then as soon as they take over, they send the national police force out into the country to suppress the population, to prevent anybody from organizing with an eye to overthrowing the dictator. And of course, we're all familiar with such modern examples as left-wing totalitarian socialist dictator Adolf Hitler, who of course is the favorite example that the liberals use. This is why I use that example all the time. And of course, Hitler had a national police force, which we see dramatized time after time in motion pictures on the television. He didn't call it a national police force. He couldn't speak English. But of course, as we all know, that's exactly what the Geheimstaatspolizei, the Gestapo for short, was. It was a national police force with unlimited powers, and any time they heard that there was any suggestion that there was a group of German people who might not be perfectly satisfied with Hitler's totalitarian socialist dictatorship, of course the national police force would go to those people and lock them up. Standard operating procedure, once again, in a dictatorship. Russia, of course, has a national police force. They keep changing the name of it. Every few years, you notice they put different initials on it. Lately, they're calling it the KGB. They've always had a national police force. When they first took over, they called it the Cheka. Once again, this is standard operating procedure. Every dictatorship has such a national police force. And so the conspiracy that we are up against in our country is, of course, as you know, doing everything it can to impose a national police force on the American people. And if you think back, 10 years or so ago, you may remember that the first method that the conspiracy devised for use in attempting to impose this national police force upon us was the idea of the Civilian Review Board. And what they were going to do was to try to create the impression that the local police were inadequate. They couldn't handle the job of protecting the people from criminals. And so they devised the idea of forming what they called a Civilian Police Review Board. And the idea of this police review board was so to criticize and harass and demoralize the local police forces around the country that they would be unable to enforce the laws that they have been charged with enforcing. And they were making a lot of headway with this scheme, and of course the first place that they tried to put it over on us in a big way was in New York City, which, as you know, is of course the biggest city in the United States, and therefore it has tremendous effect on whatever else happens everywhere in the country. And so they tried to put this scheme over on us in New York City. And Mayor Lindsay, you may remember the mayor of Fun City at the time, John Lindsay, he refused even to let the people vote upon it. And so we made a petition, and of course instrumental in this whole battle against the Police Review Board in New York City was the local organization of the John Birch Society. Believe it or not, we have a local organization in New York City. And it's a secret organization there, of course. And we devised a petition and spread the petition throughout the city. And amazingly, we were able to get enough signatures on this petition in order to get the question of the Police Review Board on the ballot. And then amazingly, in November, you will all remember, the people of New York City voted the scheme down and thereby made it impossible for Lindsay and his gang to impose the Police Review Board on us. Now, if that Police Review Board had succeeded in New York City, well then of course we would today be at a very different point, it seems to me, because that would have been the signal for the revolutionaries to impose these police review boards on just about every city across the United States, using the argument that of course New York City has one, and therefore, since New York has one, every other city has to have a police review board. So, since the people of New York voted to protect the finest, as we used to call the police in New York City, the revolutionaries at the top had to devise a different scheme in order to take control of our police across the country as part of their scheme to impose a totalitarian dictatorship upon us. And what they decided to do was to take over from the top. Instead of taking over from the bottom by forming these civilian police review boards, the idea was they would devise an excuse which they would use to take the police over from the top. Now, of course, in our country, we've always had local police departments. We have a police department in this town here in Pueblo, and there's a local police department in the next town, controlled by the people who pay the taxes and live in the towns where those police operate. And the reason that we have that system, of course, once again, is so that nobody can collect too much police power and therefore take control of the civil rights, the genuine civil rights of our people. So we've always had the police power in our country very carefully divided among the people in one town after another. And this was the system that the revolutionaries at the top decided to destroy. And so what they began to do, as you will remember, was they began to foment these destructive riots in one city after another. And they fomented a riot in Detroit, you may remember, where they burned down a large portion of the Negro neighborhood in New York City, in Detroit this was. And they prevented the local Detroit Police Department from enforcing the law and protecting the Negro citizens in Detroit, which the Detroit Police Department could very easily have done if they were permitted to go in and stop the rioting at the beginning, which they wanted to do. But because of the orders handed down from the top, the Detroit Police Department was prevented from going into that Negro neighborhood to protect the Negro citizens, and so the revolutionaries were able to burn down a sizable portion of the homes, the businesses, recreational areas in that area of the country. In New York City, of course, there was also a destructive riot on July 18th, 1964, you may remember, in which they burned down a sizable section, destroyed a lot of property in the Negro neighborhood there in New York City, in Harlem. And of course, in the next year, we saw the destructive riot in Watts, in Los Angeles, in which once again, revolutionaries burned down a large portion of property there, destroyed areas, businesses, recreational areas, homes in the Negro neighborhood in Watts. And we were told, of course, that the reason that these riots were taking place was that the people were dissatisfied. I drove through Watts shortly after the riot. People told me this was the Negro neighborhood there. I was a little confused. It was nicer than where I grew up. And as a matter of fact, I do recall now at the time that Sergeant Shriver had to explain this fact to the American people. People were wondering, if Watts seemed to be so nice, most of it, why would the people there be so dissatisfied? So you may remember Sergeant Shriver made a speech at the time, and he said, just because a man has a green grass lawn and palm trees on it doesn't mean that he is perfectly satisfied. You see, I mean, just because you can't see all the dissatisfaction doesn't mean that it isn't there, Sergeant Shriver said. And you may have wondered about that when you saw what Watts looked like on your television screens as they broadcast it to you from Los Angeles. And then, of course, there came the big riot, which was the riot in Chicago in 1968 at the Democrat National Convention. I was there in Chicago as an accredited correspondent for American Opinion magazine, completely spontaneously. I just happened to be passing through at the time. And later on, of course, we found out that the turmoil that you were seeing on your television screens was the product of a plan that the revolutionaries had been making for a full year. Believe it or not, they planned to produce what you saw on your television screens as early as September of 1967. The convention, of course, was in August 1968. So for a full year, they were meeting around the country, and they were planning to create the turmoil that you would see a year later on your television screens. And the plans were laid in such places as the national headquarters of the National Lawyers Guild, which of course was described by a congressional committee as one of the most important legal bulwarks of the Communist Party in the United States. And the people who were planning this turmoil were such people as Jerry Rubin, of course, who is a communist. When I saw him last at the Democrat convention in Miami in 1972, I asked him whether he was a communist. He said, of course. I asked him, can we say you're a communist? He says, yes. You can say I'm a communist. I tell you this because you know how we hate wild charges. So these revolutionaries on the bottom were planning to create this turmoil for a full year. Now, on your television screens, as you will remember, you were shown a full week of pictures of police knocking people down, hitting people with billy clubs, running after people, throwing people into paddy wagons, hitting college co-eds. And so the impression was created that the police had gone berserk. And you may remember later on the Walker report that was issued about the Chicago riot told us that the police had rioted. The police went berserk. What actually happened in the streets of Chicago, of course, and once again I was there, I saw this, was that the police were attacked by these revolutionaries in a way so vicious, so unbelievable, that every time I talk about it, as I'm doing now, I still can't believe that it really happened, but it did. The revolutionaries had brought a bunch of college students to Chicago, and they told the students that they were going to demonstrate for freedom, liberty, and an open convention. And when the students got there, they were pushed up to the police lines by these experts in the back. And then when the students and the police were standing eyeball to eyeball, as Jack Kennedy liked to say, the revolutionaries in the back, the professionals, began to throw things over the heads of the students at the police the students were facing. And the things they threw included rocks, bottles, stones, jagged chunks of asphalt that they had ripped from the roadways in the various parks, lye. They squirted this oven cleaner on the police. You know, that oven cleaner, it's got lye in it. It's some kind of a very caustic thing. And on the can it says, wear gloves when you use this stuff. You squirt it in the oven. Somehow it cleans out your oven. They squirted that stuff on the police. They threw potatoes studded with razor blades, balls studded with nails and spikes, all in a deliberate attempt to provoke the police to retaliate. As a matter of fact, there was even a squad of college ladies there, and these college ladies out in the street there, they pulled down their pants, filled plastic bags with human excrement. That's the most felicitous way I can say that. And then they would throw these bags filled with human excrement on the police. Now, of course, through all this barrage, we were told later on the police should have remained absolutely motionless and let this happen to them. I couldn't do that. I doubt that many of you could either. And so it is not surprising that some of the police did retaliate, which of course was exactly what the purpose of this terrible barrage was all about. As a matter of fact, I was gassed twice with tear gas by the police, which is better than being shot. I'm here to tell you about it. And it's interesting to note, did Jan say that? It is interesting to note? Yes, I guess he did. Observe also that although this was going on for a full week, no one that we ever heard about was shot by the police. So to me, this was an incredible exercise in police discipline, the fact that under this terrible, tremendous barrage going on day after day, 24 hours a day, that no police officer cracked to the point at which one of these students, unfortunately, was shot. An amazing exercise, it seems to me, in police discipline. But remember that on your television screens, all you were shown day after day was the police hitting people. Now, we know that the television people were there to see what the revolutionaries were doing because they were standing right next to me. They had their credentials on, CBS television, NBC television. We were all running through the streets. And so they saw as well as I did what was really going on. Yet they deliberately withheld from you, from the American people, what was going on in Chicago. They deliberately withheld the reason that the police were behaving like this. So here you can see a dramatic example. There are so many such examples. Here you can see a dramatic example showing how the revolutionaries on the bottom, people like Jerry Rubin, the communist, for example, people like Tom Hayden, who is the author of the statement, "We are all Viet Cong," how they are being helped, how they are collaborating with the people at the very top, the establishment press, whom they are always criticizing and whom they are supposed to be against. Here they go into the street to create a problem, and the establishment bosses at the top, whom they are supposed to be fighting, are doing everything they can to give them all the propaganda that they needed to discredit the Chicago police. And by the way, along those lines, it's interesting to remind you that after the Chicago Convention, after Rubin and his fellow criminals were convicted for creating all this turmoil at the convention, Rubin was given a tax-exempt foundation by the Nixon administration to shelter all his earnings that he was getting by writing all this revolutionary propaganda that appears in the nation's bookstores. So here is a man who's supposed to be fighting the establishment, and he's supposed to be conducting the turmoil to overthrow the establishment, but the Nixon administration gives him a tax-exempt foundation to shelter his earnings. And as a matter of fact, when I told Jerry, I reminded Jerry in Miami that we were the people who blew him out of the waters. It was Dr. Susan Huck's article, if I remember correctly, exposing his tax-exempt foundation that blew Jerry out of the water. And somehow Jerry was very upset about this. It seems he's in it for the money after all. He told me I would be gassed when they take over. So I've been gassed already. Tear gas. So anyway, as you will remember, after the Chicago Convention was over, we began to get a lot of propaganda, and you will remember reading it, telling us that the local police are inadequate. They can't handle the job. They were inadequate in the riots. They couldn't protect the Negro people of Detroit. They couldn't protect the Negro people of Watts. And finally, here they are in the streets of Chicago, going berserk for no reason at all, attacking these innocent students who are there to demonstrate for freedom, liberty, and an open convention. So we began to hear, and you may remember reading mentions, remarks like this in the national press, we began to hear that the only solution is that the federal government should step in and advise the Chicago police, help them clean up their manners, help them deal properly with college co-eds. And in the same year, 1968, the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration was created. Now, the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration grew out of another agency called the OLEA, the Office of Law Enforcement Assistance. And that organization had given out a few $1 million in federal funds to local police departments since 1965, since the year of the Watts riot. But now in 1968, the revolutionaries at the top decided to use this scheme of giving federal funds to the local police departments as part of their scheme to take control of the police from the top. So they passed the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration bill creating that agency and began to hand billions. By this time, they've handed $2.5 billion to one local police department after another around the United States. And we are told that the purpose of this money that they are giving to the local police departments is, of course, to help the local police departments in their fight against crime. Once again, we can see how totally phony this is, because the same people who are giving the money from Washington to the local police departments to fight crime, why, these are the same people who are doing everything they can to create the crime problem in the first place. As George Wallace put it in that famous statement that he made in his 1968 campaign, it became famous because it was so true. Saturday night, you get hit on the head. The criminal is out of jail before you're out of the hospital. Monday morning, they arrest the policeman. And of course, that is still going on. I just talked, about a month or so ago, I talked with Congressman Rarick of Louisiana, for instance, and Congressman Rarick told me about a case in Washington recently where there were a couple of defendants on trial for serious felonies, and the judge, I can't recall the judge's name, the judge decided that their defense was inadequate. The judge was not satisfied with the legal defense their court-appointed attorneys were giving them, so the judge just stopped the whole proceeding and just dismissed the case and released the defendants. Here are a couple of serious felons out on the street once again, and of course this is going on around the country. This is being done by the federal court system, releasing criminals, very serious criminals, to prey upon the American people once more. So we see that the same people at the top who claim to be trying to solve the crime problem, they are creating the crime problem. And the reason that they are creating the crime problem is, once again, to provide the excuse for them to take control from the top of our local police departments. Remember, no dictator takes over in a country by telling people what he wants to do. Nobody comes into a country and says, friends, my name is Benito Mussolini. The only thing I've ever wanted to do since I was a little kid is to shove people around. It's my boyhood ambition to shove people around, so I'm taking over. I'm going to be your dictator. Since nobody wants to live under a dictatorship, the dictator knows he's got to take over by means of subterfuge. Dictators have been doing this from the beginning of recorded history. In the ancient Greek city-states 2,500 years ago, the demagogues would send mobs out into the streets to riot. And then when the people had been softened up sufficiently, the demagogues would seize control of the government, of the city-states at the top. This is what we're all familiar with in our readings of history. Dictators have been doing this from the beginning of recorded time, sending mobs out into the streets on the bottom in order to seize control at the top, allegedly as the solution to the problem they themselves are creating. So the LEAA is now spewing billions of dollars around the country into as many police departments as they can con into accepting them. Now, of course, whenever the federal government finances something, it controls what it finances according to the decision of Wickard versus Filburn in 1942. And as a matter of fact, that's a good decision. The federal government has to be able to control what it finances, just as you have to have the power to control what you finance. Otherwise, you lose complete control of your finances. So the dangerous thing then is, what should we allow the federal government to finance? And it certainly isn't police work, because exactly what we predicted and have been writing about is now happening to the police across the country. One of the things that the police are being subjected to these days is regionalization and consolidation of police departments. We are being told, as usual, that the local police can't handle the problem. They can't handle the crime problem because there are so many small police departments. There are 40,235 local police departments in the United States. And a few years back, an LEAA official named Clarence Koster made a speech. And in that speech, Mr. Koster said, today in this country, we have 40,235 law enforcement agencies, ranging from one-man departments to New York City, with more than 40,000 police officers. This many units form a completely ungovernable body. And many of you, of course, are familiar with that statement because many of us have used it, quoted it many times. And of course, what Mr. Coster is saying there is that that number of police departments is ungovernable by the people at the top. They're not ungovernable by the people who live in those towns. No one has ever complained in the towns that they can't govern their own police department through the local city governments that they have been electing. But you see, the revolutionaries at the top have been complaining that we have to get this consolidation and regionalization. Another LEAA official, Charles Rogovin, his name is, he at one time was an LEAA administrator. He once said in Miami at a convention of police chiefs, if local law enforcement fails, then something else will replace it. I do not raise the specter of a federal police force merely to frighten you. Look at the organized crime field. We now see a substantial federal effort there, and not simply because organized crime is interstate in nature. It is also because local law enforcement has failed to do its job. So in other words, the idea is being created that we have to have a takeover of the local police by the national government in order to do something about this terrible crime problem. Now, to give you a couple of examples of what this federal money is being used for, it is being used for innumerable crazy things that when you first read about, you are absolutely dumbfounded. For example, in Texas, in Tarrant County Junior College in Fort Worth, they set up a program with federal funds in which they were going to teach police officers social problems, and one of the textbooks was Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto. The police officers have to study this, apparently, in order to know how to solve crime problems in the United States. Dr. Robert Platt, who was one of the people involved in the program in Texas that I just mentioned, he tells us that the program includes sensitivity training. Sensitivity training is, of course, another name for brainwashing, which the communists inflicted on our prisoners of war in North Korea. And we can be absolutely sure of that because the National Education Association in Washington, which has never told a lie, they say in one of their publications that sensitivity training is brainwashing. So our police officers, in other words, are being neutralized. They are being prevented not only by these federal court decisions, but by these highly complicated techniques of brainwashing to neutralize them psychologically so that they are more and more unable to enforce the law. To give you a couple of other examples of what they are also doing, in Chicago, Dayton, Ohio, Oakland, California, Seattle, some of the biggest cities in our country, they are using such brainwashing techniques on the police as what they call maximized role-playing, small group interaction. These are just high-class terms for the same thing. Videotape critique, and other progressive approaches to understanding human values and problems. In Covina, California, the police department placed all 50 of the agency's officers, unidentified, in various situations that were foreign to them. And by the way, I'm reading from the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration's own publications here. Officers were booked into the jail of another jurisdiction. They were required to live for several days on the skid row of a neighboring city, to join a picket line in front of a so-called lewd movie house, and to attend a love-in dressed as participants. Officers reported that the course gave them a greater understanding of nonverbal communication and increased their awareness of its effect on the attitudes and beliefs of others. Now, I went to see the people who run the Police Foundation, which is, of course, a creation of the Ford Foundation, which, as you know, supports one communist operation after another. I went to see the leaders of the Police Foundation, which uses Ford Foundation money to finance various of these schemes. They invited me in. I met with them all. I even met with Commissioner Patrick Murphy, formerly of New York City, and who now is the head of the Police Foundation. And I spent a full day talking with all the directors. You see, you get a haircut like this, they let you in everywhere. They tell you anything you want to know. And one of the things that they're doing, one of the schemes that they are using is they are trying to push as many police departments as possible to hire women as police officers on the street who actually work just like the men do in policing. And one of the criticisms that so many professional police officers have about this new program is that they fear that this program, which is now getting underway, may have a tendency to increase violence. At the Police Foundation, they told me that the purpose of this scheme is to prevent violence, because the presence of a woman in one of these violent situations might have a tendency to calm the participants down. Also, one of the directors of the Police Foundation, a very pretty lady, very delicate lady, I can't recall her name, Catherine Milton, she told me, also the lady police officer has a secret weapon. She might cry. Yeah. So the fear of the police officers that I've talked to about this is that this might have a tendency to increase violence, because if there are participants in a violent situation and they see a big Irish cop with a shillelagh, well, that has a tendency to calm people down, you see. I mean, you know, if you saw somebody like Gary Allen walking up to you with a club, you know, you'd probably simmer down a little bit, see. But the idea of the professionals is that if they see 5 feet ladies walking up there asking them daintily to stop fighting, you see, this might be an incentive to the criminal to, you know, to try to break out or do something, because he might figure he could get away with it. So this is one of the new progressive schemes that the revolutionaries at the top are trying to put over on us. Another scheme that they are using now, they call team policing. And team policing seems to boil down to one of these same brainwashing schemes that SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, has been using for years. The Police Foundation director who told me about it told me that they call it participatory democracy in policing. And the way this works is, instead of the police officers going in to act, they simply stand around and debate with each other, you see, what step that they're supposed to take. You know, you have a violent situation, it takes instant reaction, instant decision on the part of the police officer. Well, apparently they're supposed to sit around and debate, discuss, you see, exactly what to do. And by the way, this reminds me, when I was run out of Colorado Springs, a few years ago, when I was run out of Colorado Springs, the police were called, and they came in, and this was a few years ago, before I became aware of these new techniques. The police came in, and you know, usually when police come in to take over a situation, you know, they make decisions and they act. They find out who's who, and then they make a proper decision. Well, these police, I'm sure they were very fine gentlemen, but here are a bunch of criminals coming into our meeting to break up the meeting. And as a matter of fact, after the meeting was over, they went out and firebombed our bookstore. Well, here are the police coming in to size up the situation, and the police didn't do anything there. See, they just stood around on the stage, and they didn't say anything, didn't do anything. And they permitted the criminals to break up our meeting. So instead of sizing the situation up and taking an active part in what was going on, see, they had been neutralized to the point at which they didn't say anything, they didn't do anything, they just stood around on the stage. So here you have an example of what this type of brainwashing does. As a matter of fact, also here in Colorado, in Boulder, I guess it is, they have this system going full blast. And one of the things that they do in Boulder is they have a sensitivity training session for all new recruits, brainwashing, and Lieutenant William Kowalski, who is the Community and Press Relations Officer for the Boulder County Sheriff's Department, he told Tim Heinen, who is one of our speakers and writers, as you know, he told Tim Heinen that part of the session includes having male officers stripped of their clothing and tied with their hands behind their backs by female employees. This is done without the officer's prior knowledge or consent. So apparently the recruits are walking through the halls, and suddenly the doors in the corridors open and women employees jump out, attack them, and strip their clothes off. And the thinking behind all this is so that the officer will know what it's like to be raped. Now, once again, you hear about a lot of these things, and You can hardly believe them. Sounds like a scene from one of these modern movies. But incredible though they sound, these are just a few of the things that are actually happening. Now, another very dangerous scheme that they are now using is a scheme in which they use block captains. And this is another scheme that they told me about in Washington when I interviewed the heads of the Police Foundation. In a booklet that the Police Foundation publishes, which they call Team Policing, here's what it says. The enthusiasm of the members was reflected in the block captain program. 150 block captains were recruited in the first month, and another 150 by the fall. Block captains were residents who agreed to maintain a regular liaison with police. The team members held frequent meetings with the people of a particular block at the block captain's home. The Venice team, talking about the use of the scheme in California, the Venice team developed direct citizen support to an extraordinary degree. Hundreds of block captains exchanged crime information with police on a regular basis. The Holyoke team caught more than one burglar after citizen calls traced them out of windows, down alleys, over fences, and across the railroaded tracks. The team in the flats virtually abandoned preventive patrol since the citizenry informed them immediately of many crimes in progress. In other words, what we are being handed now is a scheme in which the people, to prevent crime, will cooperate with the police, and they will report to the police all the various things going on in the neighborhood, you see. And the idea behind all this scheme, developed by the same people at the top who are creating the crime problem, is to help the police enforce the law. Now, this sounds very good on the surface. We want the police. It's a good thing for the people to collaborate and to help the police. This is a very good idea. We wish we could get more of the citizenry in our country to help the police. But this scheme should sound familiar to you if you are a regular reader of American Opinion magazine. Many of you, I'm sure, have read the June issue of American Opinion. Did you read that article about Cuba? I can't recall who wrote it. I guess it was Richard Band, the article about what is going on these days in Cuba. And did you remember reading at the end of the article about an organization called the Movement for the Defense of the Revolution? MDR, it is called. What's that Movement for the Defense of the Revolution? What this movement is it's a huge organization in Cuba to which there are several 100,000 members, which in a small country like Cuba is a huge percentage of the population. And this organization has a member every 4 houses. See, every 4 houses there's an official of this Movement for the Defense of the Revolution. And what these people's job is they keep track of what all the citizens are doing, you see. They observe your movements. And anything that you do, as a matter of fact, you have to report to the block captain, to the official of the Movement for the Defense of the Revolution in Cuba. Once again, this is something that every modern dictator does. He forms a network of neighborhood spies. And the purpose of that network of neighborhood spies is to keep the population under control. The idea is, if these officials, these hirelings at the top, find out that somebody is organizing, or even that somebody is dissatisfied, they report that information to the people at the top, and then the people at the top take the necessary disciplinary action, whatever it may require, either incarceration or loss of privileges or simple execution. So, you see that using the phony crime wave that the revolutionaries at the top are creating, they are now beginning to create exactly this same network of neighborhood spies that Castro is using right now in order to keep the Cuban population under control. This is one of the most dangerous developments that it seems to me that we see developing. So this is something I urge you strongly to be aware of. Also along these lines, in Dallas recently, the Ford Foundation tried to put over another scheme which they call preactive policing. Now, in our system, you know, somebody is innocent until proven guilty. And we assume somebody's innocent until he commits a crime. Then we're supposed to lock him up. But what the people at the Ford Foundation are now trying to put over on us, in addition to this idea of block captains, is an idea where they find out, even before you know it yourself, that you're going to commit a crime. And they do this, once again, by finding out everything about you. See, every fact about you, and then they know so much about you, they know more about you than you know about you. And then this gives them the capability, you see, to come and lock you up, to detain you, even before you realize that you were going to go out and rob a bank or something. See, they know it before you do. And it's interesting to note that this scheme of pre-active policing, you would think that these people who call themselves liberals, who are always worried about our civil rights, wouldn't you think that they would be up in arms about something like this? You notice that this scheme is never mentioned, you never hear anything like this mentioned on the CBS Evening News. Typical example, showing once again that the revolutionaries at the top are total phonies, and that they are collaborating with their stooges at the bottom, like Jerry Rubin in this department, for example, all collaborating toward their goal, which they hope to achieve, of arranging a national police force with unlimited powers. Now, another thing that they are also doing lately is they are recruiting their new national police force in the prisons. Now, this is something that many of us also have written about. I wrote an article about it a while back, and others of us have also written articles. They know that the new police force they are going to impose upon us, if they are successful, has to be so brutal and vicious that normal human beings couldn't belong to it. So as in every communist country, they are recruiting the new police force in the prisons, because only in the prisons can they find people low enough and vicious enough in order to impose dictatorship on the American people. And once again, we knew that they were going to do this because they do this in every country. When they take over a country, they empty the jails, and the criminals are made the new police officers. The real police officers are put into the jails. This is what they do in every country when they take over. Now, in our country, they are doing the same thing, recruiting these revolutionary bands in the prisons. And, for example, we've been reading lately about the SLA. And, of course, the SLA, you have all read by this time, I am sure, the SLA was recruited in a California correctional institution. The revolutionaries go there, are permitted to walk around inside the institutions, almost free run of the institution, and in these penal institutions, they recruit the revolutionaries into these gangs, which later caused so much turmoil, so many problems on the streets of our cities. So this is something that is now going on. The SLA, the so-called Symbionese Liberation Army, is a direct result of it. And now the latest thing that we see happening is, of course, the attempt to destroy the National Guard. Now, this is a scheme I just wrote about. I guess it was in the June issue. Yeah, I guess it's the current issue of American Opinion magazine. And in that article, I show you how the revolutionaries are trying to frame 8 National Guardsmen for the shooting of 4 students on the campus at Kent State University in 1970. Now, you may remember my writing that in 1970, Jerry Rubin was permitted to speak on the campus. He's a convicted criminal, remember. He has been convicted for leading the turmoil in Chicago in 1968. So here it is, 1970, and he's a convicted criminal, and he's admitted onto the campus at Kent State University, and he speaks, he tells the students, kill your parents. Once again, this is another incredible thing you can't believe anybody really says. This is the kind of speech Jerry Rubin makes. Kill your parents, he said, because until you're ready to kill your parents, you're not ready for the revolution. He said, I mean that quite literally. We have to kill our parents because our parents are our first oppressors. That word for word was what Jerry Rubin told the students. And would you believe it, 3 weeks later, the revolution spontaneously broke out on the campus at Kent State University. 4 students were killed in a confrontation with the National Guard. Now, just recently, earlier this year, 8 of those guardsmen were indicted, and they are now going to trial accused of violating the civil rights of the students who were killed. If those National Guardsmen who are on the campus as a result of the direct orders of their governor, if they are convicted, well, it seems to me obvious that this is going to neutralize and demoralize the National Guard across the country, because few guardsmen are going to want to go out into the street to obey legal orders of their governor if they think that they're going to be locked up for obeying those legal orders. And if the National Guard is demoralized, this will provide the excuse for the revolutionaries at the top to use regular army troops and the National Police Force in order to stop such problems as arose on the campus at Kent State University. So you see, so many of these techniques all being used for one purpose, to arrange a national police force with unlimited powers, which is always the key hallmark of every totalitarian dictatorship. Now, let me not leave you by any means in the depressed mood that I have now gotten you into, because the fact is we are making tremendous progress along the lines of alerting the local police chiefs and police departments about what is going on. And just let me give you one example, which you read about it. As a matter of fact, it was written about some months back, a couple of months back in the bulletin. Just let me remind you of what happened in Milwaukee. In Milwaukee, these same Police Foundation people went to Milwaukee to hold a police seminar. And the idea was to show Milwaukee what they needed to do in order to modernize their police department, to improve their police procedures. Now, of course, Milwaukee, according to the FBI's own statistics, is the safest big city in the United States. In Milwaukee, a woman can come out of her house, go to her car, go to the supermarket, buy groceries, get back in her car, drive home, carry the groceries in her house, and most of the time, she won't be attacked. This is the safest big city in the United States. So you would think they would be coming from Washington to Milwaukee to learn how to do this. But instead, they're going from Washington, they're going to Milwaukee to teach them how to conduct the police department. So they were going to hold a seminar in order to get publicity in the Milwaukee press to revise the police procedures. Our coordinator in the area, Rich Zablicki, the Polish patriot, led our forces to the seminar, and the members who were at the seminar outnumbered everybody else who was there. We had about, I think we had more than half of the participants in the conference were members. And they had an interesting little thing that they did. On their backs, right back here, they had a sticker, "Support your local police." So this meant that when they were all sitting in the audience, they saw this forest of our stickers, you see, giving a good feeling of solidarity. But of course, since most of our members looked normal, the people on the stage had no way of knowing, who these people were, you see. So what happened was the fellow that they sent from Washington to give the Police Foundation speech, he only talked for 15 or 20 minutes, refused to answer any questions, and then he and his colleague, who were sent to Milwaukee in order to conduct the meeting, they escaped from the hall, went to Mitchell Field, got on a plane, flew back to Washington. As far as I know, they haven't been back since. And the result of all this planning was, and by the way, they had little seminars. You see, they had a big meeting, then they had little seminars, and our members volunteered to run the seminars, and they did. So the result of all this was the whole meeting fell flat on its face. You can be sure that if this meeting had come off well, the Milwaukee Sentinel and Journal would have had all the sayings of all these experts from Washington on the front page, you see, putting pressure on the police to change their methods. But the scheme fell flat on its face, and it was all the result of the educational work done by our members. So here you have a perfect example of what our educational work can do. A lot of people say, and maybe I'm sure you've all heard a lot of people say, well, when are we going to do something? Are we just going to hand out these pamphlets? I mean, when are we really going to do something? We just hand out these pamphlets. Well, we handed out these pamphlets, and this is one of the results. You're not going to hear about it on the CBS Evening News, of course. When you hear about it there, the battle is over. So here's one of the results that we get from our educational campaign. We won this big victory in Milwaukee. It can be done, and we are making tremendous progress along these lines across the country. I am happy to be able to report. I see, as I travel around the country and talk to police officers, police chiefs, we are making tremendous progress. So my advice is simply, if we can keep doing just what we're doing, simply going to the police chiefs, spreading the word, presenting our information, our films, our reprints, our books, showing them what this is all about and showing them how it is against their own interest to take these federal funds and to knuckle under to the federal bureaucrats. We can win this battle, I have no doubt, and the example I just gave you is just one indication of that. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.